September 3, 1939, was not a day for quiet contemplation in the capital of the Reich. Yet the office of Korvettenkapitän Klaus Richter, deep within the Oberkommando der Marine in Berlin, was a sanctuary of calculated precision. Outside, the news of the French and British declarations of war thundered like an approaching storm, but inside, the air was still, heavy only with the scent of fine cigar smoke and machine oil. Richter, a man whose faith lay not in ideology, but in the cold, perfect logic of engineering, ran a manicured finger across the gleaming chrome and polished brass of the machine before him, the Enigma G312. This was no mere typewriter, it was the ultimate electro-mechanical guardian of Germany's military intentions, the physical embodiment of the nation's unshakable conviction in its own technical supremacy. Richter's unwavering belief in this device was not simply professional, it was almost religious, for the Enigma was, mathematically, inviolable. The German High Command had not simply designed a cipher machine, they had engineered a lock with no key, a puzzle with no solution that did not first require the brute force of a lifetime of calculation. A technical deep dive reveals the mechanism's frightening complexity. A message was typed on the keyboard and scrambled by a complex pathway of electricity routed through 3, sometimes 4, interchangeable rotors, each with 26 possible positions. The current then passed through a reflector, which bounced the signal back through the rotors a second time, guaranteeing that no letter could ever encrypt as itself, a small but devastating detail for any potential cryptographer. The total number of possible daily key settings, once factoring in the rotor order, the ring settings, and the crucial plugboard connections, which added a final, savage layer of scrambling, was not merely large, it was a cosmological number, 159 quintillion possible combinations. Richter knew, with the cold certainty of a man reading a theorem, that to attempt to break this code was not merely difficult, it was an exercise in futility, a technical absurdity. A full generation of engineers and mathematicians working around the clock would be required merely to test a fraction of the daily possibilities. This elegant silent machine, sitting pristine on his desk, granted the Kriegsmarine an impenetrable shield, allowing the commanders to communicate their movements across the continent and the Atlantic with the certainty of a man speaking into an empty room. This conviction of technical invulnerability was the essential lubricant for the Reich's emerging, terrifying industrial engine. As Richter reviewed the day's encoded messages detailing deployment orders, his mind inevitably turned to the rising scale of the industrial war machine, a physical manifestation of German will that would soon be guided by the perfect secrecy of his Enigma messages. In the shipyards dotting the coast, the pace was accelerating to an almost maniacal pitch. Data points flowed across his desk, not in the low, quiet hum of intellectual theory, but in the overwhelming figures of mass production. The assembly lines for the Type 7 U-boat were already exceeding their quotas, spitting out steel-hulled predators at a dizzying rate, each vessel a technological marvel, designed for the deep-sea ambush. Soon, the initial handful of raiders would swell to fleets, then to wolfpacks, the sheer number of submarines becoming an unstoppable force, capable of strangling the British Isles into submission. Richter saw the future not as an ideological contest, but as a vast technical ledger where German genius and industrial efficiency would inevitably overwhelm the Allies' logistical vulnerability. He imagined the merchant convoys, mere fat targets for his U-boat commanders, their positions and routes revealed by reconnaissance, their fate sealed by an encrypted message directing a dozen steel torpedoes into their flanks. The ultimate irony, the tragic counterintuitive scenario that would one day define the conflict, lay in the gap between German technical faith and the coming Allied industrial capacity. The Enigma gave the Germans an incredible initial advantage, the sight on the rifle, but that sight was attached to a rifle that, in the long run, would be dwarfed by the limitless arsenal of its enemy. Richter, however, knew nothing of this imbalance. He saw only the perfect mathematics of the cipher, the elegant geometry of the U-boat hull, and the swift, devastating success in Poland. Later that evening, at a small gathering of fellow officers, flushed with confidence and the knowledge of their secret weapon, Richter raised his glass. The room was filled with the iron laughter of men convinced of their own supremacy, a sound of absolute, unassailable confidence that would, in time, curdle into existential terror. One of his colleagues, a man from naval intelligence, spoke the terrible, ironic sentence that would later stand as the final testament to their delusion, the core of the mathematics of defeat that was already being quietly constructed in the English countryside. "Our codes are safe, gentlemen," he proclaimed, his voice thick with certainty. "They are safe until the sun burns out." The polished gleam of Korvettenkapitän Richter's Enigma machine, the perfect hubristic centerpiece of German certainty, found its counterpoint not in a competing monument of chrome and brass, but in the improbable ramshackle sprawl of Bletchley Park, a Victorian country manor house 35 miles north of London. Here, in the damp, drafty halls of what the inmates wryly dubbed the Clockwork Kingdom, the government code and cipher school was assembling the intellectual infrastructure of a quiet, desperate revolution. This was a war fought not by the sons of military tradition, but by the misfits, the academics, and the IIA non-traditional recruits pulled from the sequestered corridors of Britain's elite universities. A startling assemblage of linguists, chess masters, crossword puzzle champions, and, most crucially, mathematicians from Cambridge and Oxford. The High Command had sought a fortress of intellect, and what they got was a madhouse of genius, a chaotic, brilliant collective dedicated to defeating the seemingly perfect mathematics of the enemy. The initial efforts were a sustained exercise in frustrating failure. The German three-rotor Enigma, with its 159 quintillion combinations and its fiendishly clever plugboard, proved a terrifyingly effective barrier. The vastness of the problem was an overwhelming, tangible presence in the cramped, freezing huts of Bletchley, a mathematics of destruction that mocked every attempt at elegant solution. The central figure of this struggle, the man who provided the first essential architecture for the counterattack, was Alan Turing, a mathematician of startling, almost alien brilliance. Turing understood that human ingenuity alone could not defeat a machine designed to defy it. The only answer was a counter-machine, an electro-mechanical monster capable of brute-forcing the problem. This was the genesis of the Bombe, a colossal rack-mounted apparatus, a physical embodiment of pure logic, designed not to decrypt messages, but to rapidly test possible Enigma settings until the impossible key was found. It was a terrifying exercise in engineering, yet its initial successes were marginal, yielding only a thin trickle of operational intelligence, a mere handful of decoded messages per week, utterly dwarfed by the volume of U-boat traffic. It is here, in the quiet, unrelenting shadow of Turing's genius and the Bombe's mechanical clamor, that the true, unsung architects of the victory to come labored. We turn now to Dr. Elara Vance, a young, reserved mathematician whose presence at Bletchley was an indictment of the broader world's institutional biases, for a woman of her caliber should have been lecturing at a great university, not hiding her brilliance in a wartime hut. Vance embodied the essential GC&CS credo: to defeat the machine, one must first defeat the man operating it. Her genius lay not in the grand architecture of computing, but in a seemingly trivial optimization that would ultimately become cosmically significant. The Bombe worked by identifying cribs, likely phrases in the German message, and testing settings against them. But the initial testing logic was still wildly inefficient. Vance, through relentless analytical labor, reduced the immense 26 factorial possibility space of the internal rotor wirings by focusing on the logical impossibilities inherent in the German machine's design and human operational procedures. She streamlined the menu setup, the wiring instructions for the Bombe, reducing the time it took to eliminate thousands of hours of fruitless machine time by applying a simple yet devastating logical reduction to the potential rotor sequences. This was not a flash of sudden insight, but a testament to slow-burn, deep-dive data exposition, a silent, incremental triumph of the mind over a machine. Her work meant that the Bombe, already a revolutionary machine, now moved with exponentially greater efficiency, transforming from a curiosity into a truly functional weapon. At the time, Vance's achievement passed unremarked in the official reports, a single line detailing a 30% increase in the successful key-finding rate. The total output of decoded messages remained, for now, a thin trickle, but that trickle, thanks to her unseen intervention, was now flowing with a greater, more rhythmic pulse. It was the precise, trivial detail that accelerated the whole operation, the small gear adjustment that meant the difference between total darkness and the first glimmer of operational light. While Richter across the channel laughed at the presumed safety of his 159 quintillion combinations, Elara Vance, wrapped in a thick cardigan against the hut's persistent cold, had just quietly and definitively reduced the practical, actionable number by a factor of hundreds of thousands, laying the groundwork for the avalanche of destruction that ultra-intelligence would soon unleash. The cold, indifferent expanse of the North Atlantic in 1941 was not merely a maritime battlefield, it was a graveyard of steel and oil, an existential drain threatening to suck the lifeblood from the Allied war effort. While Elara Vance toiled in the quiet solitude of Bletchley Park, the scale of the destruction far outpaced the nascent trickle of ultra-intelligence. This was the Blackout War, waged by Korvettenkapitän Klaus Richter and his peers, who were now employing the perfect secrecy of their communications to execute wolfpack tactics with devastating rhythmic efficiency. Consider the juxtaposition of scales, the single, terrified merchant sailor freezing on the deck of a tramp steamer in the twilight, his nerves shredded by the constant threat of the unseen predator, versus the macro data of the German war machine. The sailor knew only the immediate, visceral reality, the sudden, unmistakable sound of the tin fish, the torpedo, approaching, followed by the thunderclap beneath the waves that tore the bottom out of his world, replacing solid deck with churning, oil-slicked abyss. But the strategic reality was far more terrifying. By the end of 1942, the U-boat tally had reached a staggering 3 million tons of Allied shipping sunk, a hemorrhaging wound that defied all conventional attempts at closure. Richter, now a seasoned U-boat ace with the Iron Cross pinned to his chest, embodied the confidence of a commander operating with an unimpeachable, invisible shield. The perfect security of his encrypted Enigma messages allowed him to coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles of open ocean, orchestrating a ballet of destruction. His patrols became a relentless, focused menace. He could receive orders, target grid AB 452, convoy SC 107 inbound, and execute them with the surgical precision granted by communication that the enemy, he knew, could not possibly read. His faith in German technical supremacy was constantly validated by the mounting statistical evidence of his success. And the enemy was getting stronger, industrially, faster than the Allies could respond. The German shipyards, driven by efficiency and purpose, were escalating their output of steel hulls towards 30 U-boats per month, a figure that threatened to render the Atlantic supply line permanently unmanageable. The logistics of the convoys, the sheer unmanageable scale of moving millions of gallons of fuel, millions of tons of steel, and billions of rounds of ammunition, were being systematically undermined by this escalating force. Every ship lost represented not just tonnage, but a crippling delay in the building of the very tanks and planes needed for the counterattack. The danger was pervasive, rendered in sensory detail. The sea was no longer just water. It was the chilling, metallic stench of diesel fuel and raw, crude oil mixing with salt, the black evidence of defeat floating across the waves. The need for ultra-intelligence, therefore, was not a matter of intellectual curiosity or a professional contest between code makers and code breakers. It was an existential, material necessity. Without the ability to read the U-boat's encrypted orders to predict where Richter and his peers would strike next, the Allies were fighting blind, reacting to a disaster rather than preventing it. The ships that were meant to carry the colossal output of the soon-to-be activated American industrial capacity, the very tanks and aircraft that would win the war, were instead becoming merely floating targets. The dramatic realization, the cold truth that hung over Bletchley Park and the Admiralty war rooms was this: if the Enigma shield could not be pierced, then the unlimited resources of the United States, its billions of dollars and millions of tons of steel, would simply be poured into a limitless drain. The industrial might of a continent would be negated by a few hundred technologically superior submarines, commanded with perfect security. The battle was not yet one of machines versus machines, but of genius versus necessity, and the necessity demanded that the secret, silent work of the mathematicians, of the quiet revolution led by Dr. Elara Vance, must succeed, or the war would be lost before the American avalanche even began to roll. The moment of existential peril, the precipice upon which the fate of the North Atlantic teetered, arrived in the spring of 1942 with the quiet, chilling click of an additional rotor. Korvettenkapitän Richter and his fellow U-boat aces, flush with their continued, terrifying success, had been granted a final, devastating layer of technical supremacy: the German M4 Enigma machine, specifically for the U-boat fleet. This was the addition of a fourth rotor, an event meant to plunge the Allies back into the absolute darkness of the pre-code breaking era. It was a mathematical reassertion of German invincibility, multiplying the already cosmological number of potential combinations to a point that seemed definitively, crushingly out of reach. In the damp, cramped Hut 6, the news landed like a physical blow. The thin, vital trickle of decryptions achieved by months of brutal intellectual labor dried up, ceasing entirely. Despair became a palpable presence. The fear of immediate failure stalked the halls of the manor, for it was understood that every day without ultra-intelligence meant dozens more ships sunk, the entire logistical lifeline of Britain severed. The brilliant architecture of Alan Turing and the grinding labor of the Bombe machines had been rendered instantly obsolete by a single, malicious gear. The problem was no longer just the M4's internal complexity, but the sheer, paralyzing workload of trying to brute force a four-rotor setup with the existing technology. It was at this moment, the absolute nadir of the intellectual battle, that Dr. Elara Vance achieved her quiet, decisive triumph. A breakthrough rooted not in the esoteric mathematics of the Enigma itself, but in the operational limitations of the human beings who had been so certain of its perfection. Vance recognized the ultimate irony. The German machine was brilliant, but the German operators were simply human, afflicted with predictable habits and a deep-seated technical laziness. She focused her relentless analytical labor on the key setting procedure for the M4, the protocols for selecting and positioning the rotors. She discovered that in their haste and confidence, the operators frequently used certain predictable starting positions, or that their internal regulations mandated the inclusion of specific, repeated phrases, the cribs, in the daily test messages. Her insight was an operational mathematical approach. By analyzing the human choices that filtered the M4's output, she could dramatically restrict the vastness of the machine's 159 quintillion possible settings back into a manageable few hundred. Vance's work created a new, streamlined logical menu for the bombs, bypassing the brute force search by preemptively eliminating mathematically unlikely rotor orders based on observable human error and protocol. This seemingly small logical reduction proved to be the lever that moved the world. The results were immediate and dramatic, the data points shifting with the velocity of an avalanche. The decryption output surged from a mere handful of messages per week to an average of 30 critical decryptions per day, giving the Allies a 24 to 48-hour window into the U-boat command structure. The EI darkness was violently pierced, replaced by a sudden, exhilarating omniscience. This climax at the midpoint in the intellectual war coincided precisely with the final cataclysmic activation of the American industrial mobilization. If Vance's genius was the sight, the United States was providing the rifle, a weapon of unbelievable scale and unprecedented firepower, now ready to be guided. The numerical evidence of this industrial supremacy reads like the prelude to a biblical flood. American factories, unmolested by enemy bombers, were completing a Liberty ship in less than a month, resulting in a total build of over 10,000 emergency cargo vessels. Steel production for the war effort eclipsed the combined Axis output, and the air factories were completing over 300,000 military aircraft, an unimaginable, rhythmic pulse of production. This was the true avalanche of steel and lead. The irony of abundance was the new strategic reality. The American system was so vast, so rich in resources, that its logistical challenge was managing strategic waste, using 6,000 rounds per minute on a machine gun, building ships faster than the U-boats could sink them, and producing fuel in quantities that allowed for operational extravagance. This stood in stark, brutal contrast to the German system, which, for all its technical genius, was inherently resource-limited. The M4 Enigma had been designed to keep the Allies in the dark, but Vance's quiet, analytical brilliance had flipped the switch, suddenly illuminating the targets for an unstoppable industrial force that was now, finally, ready to be unleashed. The mathematics of defeat had found its first definitive proof. The moment the mathematical revelation of Dr. Elara Vance fully converged with the avalanche of steel of the American production machine, the nature of the air war over Europe shifted from a contest of skill to a brutal rhythmic exercise in industrial supremacy. This new reality was best embodied by the airborne instruments of destruction that now began to rain down upon the Reich, guided by the flawless vision of ultra-intelligence. Here, the contrast was both stark and deeply symbolic. The sleek, elegant German Bf-109 versus the seemingly ill-conceived American heavy fighter, the P-47 Thunderbolt. German pilots, steeped in the doctrine of elegant technical efficiency, initially dismissed the American arrival with derisive laughter. They called the P-47 a flying milk bottle, or a corpulent beast, an over-engineered, heavy brute, incapable of the graceful maneuverability that defined aerial combat. Their Bf-109 was a surgical instrument, light, fast, and driven by a single, powerful cannon. It was the epitome of refined design, built on the principle of minimal necessary material. The P-47, by contrast, was built on the principle of unlimited resources and strategic excess. The revelatory data point was simple, overwhelming, and absolute. The P-47 could absorb an amount of damage that was utterly unthinkable for its German counterpart. Its thick-skinned construction, self-sealing fuel tanks, and massive radial engine, a veritable fortress of air-cooled steel, meant that pilots frequently returned to base with hundreds of holes peppering their wings and fuselage, a physical resilience born of unconstrained material abundance. German engineering prioritized speed and climb rate. American engineering prioritized survivability and firepower. Critically, the Thunderbolt did not carry a single cannon, but was armed with a battery of 8-caliber 50 machine guns, all centrally mounted in the wings, capable of delivering a combined, overwhelming 6,000 rounds per minute, an unprecedented density of lead. This was not surgery. It was a sheet of incandescent steel and lead, an avalanche of metal designed to shred anything in its path. Ultra-intelligence, the direct and definitive product of Vance's earlier quiet genius, was now the invisible hand directing this industrial might. fighter sweeps were no longer based on broad patrols, but on specific, actionable targets. German airfields at their most vulnerable moment, trains loaded with irreplaceable supplies, and most crucially, the Luftwaffe fighter formations attempting to intercept the heavy American bomber streams. The B-17s and B-24s, now accompanied by the P-47 hammers from heaven, moved not with random luck, but with an unnatural precision, minimizing exposure and maximizing the destruction of their targets. This terrifying new reality was brought into sharp, visceral focus for Major Karl von Weizsäcker, a high-ranking Luftwaffe ace and contemporary of the U-boat captain Richter, a man who had built his reputation on the elegant dominance of the Bf-109. In a blinding engagement over the Ruhr Valley, Weizsäcker witnessed his squadron, a collection of highly skilled pilots, decimated by a P-47 escort that seemed to know their every tactical move. His astonishment was complete, transforming quickly into a dreadful, chilling fear. He later recounted, in an intercept that would, decades later, prove the point of this entire narrative, his sense that the American pilots were not merely reacting to events, but were acting on a preordained script. "They knew where we would be before we did," he wrote, the statement embodying the horrifying realization that their communications, their positions, and their intentions had been utterly compromised. The mathematical shield had dissolved, and the German military was now operating within a cage of Allied omniscience. The immediate, devastating application of this precision was not just tactical, it was strategic. The data point that proved the lethal combination of ultra and American industrial production came with the targeted destruction of a crucial German oil tanker fleet moving through the Bay of Biscay. Guided by the precise, time-sensitive intercepts provided by Vance's system, a flight of P-47s and bombers was vectored to a location that German Naval Command believed to be perfectly secure. The resulting conflagration was a crippling logistical blow, confirming the new cold mathematics of the war. With oil, German tanks could move and German planes could fly. Without it, the entire technically brilliant war machine became a static, expensive museum piece. The P-47, the flying milk bottle, was not a refined design. It was a physical manifestation of industrial inevitability, now guided by the unerring eye of Ultra, transforming every 6,000 rounds per minute into an act of strategic, calculated destruction. The true victory in a war of industrial capacity is not secured through the flash of a sudden battlefield triumph, but through the slow, strategic strangulation of the enemy's logistical network, a campaign best understood as cold, unapologetic military business history. With the Ultra shield now decisively pierced by the quiet genius of Dr. Elara Vance, Allied efforts shifted from tactical survival in the North Atlantic to the deliberate, data-driven destruction of the German economic heart. The intelligence flowed from Bletchley Park, transforming from a defensive warning system into a precise operational map of the Reich's vulnerabilities. Ultra allowed the Allies to read the German logistical map with the clarity of a corporate balance sheet, exposing the absolute Achilles heel of the German war machine: oil. Intercepted Enigma messages detailed the precise locations of major fuel depots, the capacity of the synthetic oil plants, and the critical operational schedules of the railway marshalling yards moving this essential lifeblood. The German command, relying on the purported invincibility of their codes, had unwittingly provided the coordinates for their own demise. The strategic pivot, known officially as the Oil Campaign, was a devastating statistical reveal that demonstrated the true, overwhelming scale of the industrial disparity. The Allies, backed by the vast protected oil fields of the American continent and the Middle East, commanded a staggering reserve of 1.8 billion barrels of oil, a figure so large it defied easy comprehension, representing an effectively unlimited resource. Germany, however, was critically reliant on its own dwindling reserves and a complex network of vulnerable synthetic fuel plants. The mathematics of defeat dictated that the fastest way to victory was to render the German war machine immobile. The bombing campaign, guided entirely by the flawless targeting data from Ultra, focused with surgical precision on these synthetic fuel facilities. Consider the fate of the Luna synthetic fuel plants on a precise date in May of 1944. The Allied air forces, directed to within a kilometer of the target, dropped a tonnage of bombs that crippled the plant's output by 90% in a single, sustained raid. This was not random bombardment. It was the clinical execution of a strategic death sentence, the result of a cost-benefit analysis that determined fuel was a more valuable target than armament factories. The consequence of this ultra-guided strangulation was immediate and profound. Without fuel, the formidable German panzer divisions, the very spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, were reduced to nothing more than static artillery pieces, their powerful 88mm guns welded to immobile steel chassis. Similarly, the Luftwaffe, for all its technical grace and the skill of its aces, was transformed into a grounded museum piece, its hangars full of machines that could not fly. The final damning data point was the near-zero allocation of fuel to pilot training, ensuring that even if a miraculous reserve was found, there would be no one left with the hours to fly the planes. The irony of the situation was the defining characteristic of this stage of the war. For the Americans, the logistical challenge was frequently the management of their overwhelming surplus. The military actually struggled with the sheer volume of fuel and materials, sometimes resorting to the destruction of excess stocks to avoid logistical overload. Meanwhile, across a crumbling Europe, German combat units were paralyzed by a critical lack of a few thousand gallons of petrol. This cosmic imbalance was felt most acutely at the human level. Far from the grand Berlin offices and the bustling Bletchley huts, deep in the mud of the Eastern Front, stood an anonymous German farmer's son, a young Wehrmacht panzer driver named merely Johann. He stood by his heavy Panther tank, its engine silent, its gun uselessly pointed toward a distant tree line. Johann, a product of a resource-poor nation that had staked everything on technical efficiency, stared in frustration at the complex array of dials and gauges, all showing the same absolute zero. The massive, beautiful machine, the pinnacle of German engineering, was utterly immobile. His individual mechanical failure, the inability to move a few tons of steel, was the direct visceral consequence of a strategic, ultra-informed campaign to choke the fuel lines thousands of miles away. It was the juxtaposition of scales, one soldier's ration of despair set against the 1.8 billion barrels of abundance enjoyed by his enemy, a final, tangible proof that the war had been transformed from a contest of men into a cold mathematics of logistics. The strategic stage of the war, once defined by the sheer volume of steel and oil, now ascended to a new, rarefied plane, the mastery of the mind, the orchestration of the ultimate deception. The D-Day invasion, the largest amphibious assault in history, would not be secured by material force alone, but by a meticulously constructed, real-time, self-correcting strategic lie known as Operation Fortitude. This operation represented the full, devastating convergence of the American industrial avalanche with the quiet, intellectual triumph of Ultra. The German Enigma machine, cracked by the earlier mathematical revelation of Dr. Elara Vance, now provided the Allies with the perfect, terrifyingly efficient feedback loop. The operational architecture was a masterpiece of OPSEC and psychological warfare. The Allies would transmit mountains of deliberate, false communication, radio chatter, encoded traffic, and logistical movements, all designed to convince the German High Command that the invasion would land at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest distance across the Channel. Then, with a speed and precision previously impossible, Bletchley Park would intercept and decrypt the German Enigma response, reading the enemy's mind to confirm that the deception had been successful. They were able to see the German generals moving their actual irreplaceable reserve divisions to the wrong coast, instantly confirming the psychological victory of the lie. The technical deep dive into Fortitude reveals the breathtaking scale of this phantom warfare. Whole armies were conjured into existence through the meticulous logistics of illusion. There were the rubber tanks and inflatable vehicles, crafted not for combat, but to be captured by aerial reconnaissance. There was the constant, carefully managed radio traffic of General George S. Patton's fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, generating a massive, rhythmic pulse of communication that precisely mimicked the flow of a genuine, combat-ready force, down to the minutiae of supply requisitions and troop transfers. Every deliberate flicker of radio static, every strategically placed double agent, and every fake divisional patch contributed to the great illusion, all executed with the absolute confidence that the Enigma machine would confirm its efficacy. Meanwhile, Dr. Elara Vance's role at Bletchley had transformed. Her job was no longer the initial frantic struggle against the M4 rotor, but the far more delicate, strategic task of interpreting the military mindset of the recipient. Directing a small, focused team, Vance filtered out the chaff, the deliberate noise of Allied deception designed to fool the Germans from the truly critical enemy response messages. She searched for the key indicators of German belief, the movement orders for specific panzer divisions, the reallocation of coastal artillery, the operational directives confirming that the German generals were holding their essential reserves far north of the actual target zone. Her analysis moved from pure mathematics to a study of applied psychology, using the shattered confidence of the Enigma to read the enemy's strategic decisions in real time. The pacing accelerates dramatically in the scene setting for the invasion. This grand deception stood in brutal contrast to the devastating human reality being assembled just hours away. For the illusion to succeed, the reality had to be overwhelming. The immense actual fleet assembled for the Normandy beaches, hundreds of warships, and thousands of transports constituted a logistical marvel that dwarfed every previous naval operation. The precise target data, the actual coordinates of the 5 landing zones, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were known only because Ultra had confirmed the lack of German preparedness there, thanks to the success of Fortitude. The secret was not merely knowing what the enemy was saying, but knowing that the enemy believed the Allied lie. In the final hours before the D-Day launch, as the weather raged and the world held its breath, Vance was looking for one final conclusive message: the enemy's final deployment order for their reserves. When the message came through, deciphered and delivered within minutes, it confirmed the ultimate victory of the lie. The German High Command was still convinced the main attack was a feint, and that their strategic forces should remain in place, ready for the real invasion at Calais. The silence of the German panzers that night, held immobile hundreds of miles from the actual battle, was the direct, tangible proof of Vance's quiet, analytical brilliance. Fortitude was the victory of the mind over the metal, the final absolute confirmation that the mathematics of destruction had been perfectly guided by the power of unseen, ultra-omniscience. The pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, was rent by a sound that Korvettenkapitän Klaus Richter, now a weary, cynical man, instantly recognized not as battle, but as the final terrible reckoning of the industrial war. Repositioned in a concrete command bunker overlooking the invasion beaches of Normandy, the former U-boat ace, a technical true believer, had seen his faith in German supremacy slowly, brutally eroded by the mathematics of destruction. His Enigma shield had failed, his oil supply was choked, and now the combined might of the Allied avalanche of steel and lead was being delivered with a precision that was both overwhelming and unnatural. The juxtaposition of scales was instantaneous and visceral. Below him, German soldiers, individual specks of humanity, were caught in the crossfire, their desperate resistance negated by the unseen, systemic forces arrayed against them. But above the naval bombardment, the terrifying, rhythmic thunder of the Allied fleet was the true data point of industrial supremacy. It was a sustained, overwhelming percussion of hammers from heaven, the sound of American and British factories turning raw material into high-explosive ordnance, delivered with such volume that it liquefied the sand and shattered the meticulously built concrete defenses. Yet it was not the volume of fire that truly unnerved Richter. It was the absence of a German response. His eyes, trained by years of technical analysis, searched for the critical, strategic pieces that should have been there: the mobile panzer divisions, the Luftwaffe counterattack, the heavily fortified defenses guarding the exact landing zones. He found a thin, desperate line of infantry. He contrasted this with the heavy, elaborate, and ultimately pointless fortifications that stretched for miles further north, guarding the coast of the Pas-de-Calais, the fictitious invasion site established by Operation Fortitude. It was the chilling, dawning realization that the enemy possessed a total operational omniscience. They had not merely defeated the German war machine, they had outthought it entirely, reading every critical deployment decision through the shattered lens of Enigma. This D-Day invasion was the human-scale event that proved the thesis of the war. Intelligence was the force multiplier. The statistical reveal that would later confirm the monumental victory of intelligence over materiel was the precise number of German divisions held in reserve, frozen in place north of the Seine, due entirely to the success of the Fortitude deception. Estimates placed the figure at 20 divisions, including a crucial number of panzer forces, irreplaceable assets that were physically present in France but rendered strategically useless by the deception. This was not a material victory won by shooting down planes, but a monumental material victory achieved solely through ultra-intelligence, the genius of Dr. Elara Vance, translating directly into the immobility of the German defense. The dramatic tension of the early hours was a testament to the psychological warfare that had preceded it. Richter watched the relentless wave of Allied troops hit the sand and knew, with a weary finality, that the mathematical certainty of the Enigma was a lie. The moment of dawning realization was perhaps best captured hours later, far from the beaches, in an intercepted communication from a high-ranking OKW general, an angry, exhausted man who finally understood the scale of the compromise. The message, delivered directly to Bletchley Park via the Ultra system, articulated the total defeat. "We have been betrayed by our own air, our own sea, and our own wires," he transmitted, a final despairing acknowledgment that their unbreakable codes had, in fact, failed them absolutely. It is necessary, finally, to acknowledge the somber human cost that lay beneath the success of ultra-omniscience. The beaches of Normandy, particularly Omaha, saw massive, horrifying casualty numbers, a tragic, unavoidable reality of forced entry against a prepared defense. But the strategic logic is unforgiving. The thousands of lives lost on the beachhead, while a devastating human tragedy, were a fraction of the far greater number that would have been lost had the German divisions, held in place by Ultra's intelligence and Fortitude's lie, been waiting in their true positions. The brutal, cold mathematics of war dictated that Ultra had guided the ultimate invasion, transforming a potential catastrophe into a horrific but survivable breakthrough. The industrial might was the hammer, but the intelligence was the sight, ensuring that every drop of blood spilled served a strategic, purposeful end, securing the victory that the quiet, unsung intellectual heroes had made possible. The guns of the industrial war had finally fallen silent, their roar replaced by the chilling, more insidious sound of absolute secrecy. The conflict had been won through the unlimited resources of the Allied powers, the 10,000 Liberty ships, the 300,000 aircraft, and the 1.8 billion barrels of oil, all guided to their targets by the silent hand of ultra-intelligence. Yet, the moment the victory was secured, a new, suffocating directive descended upon the architects of that intelligence victory, an act of institutional memory, erasure unparalleled in modern history. The British government, concerned that the Enigma methods might still be useful, or worse, that revealing their vulnerability might arm future enemies, imposed a crushing absolute secrecy. The official mandate was unambiguous. A 50-year secrecy rule was placed upon all Bletchley Park staff. The data points of the post-war period were not about production or casualties, but about deliberate, analytical silence. Every piece of bomb equipment was systematically dismantled and destroyed. Every classified document was locked away. Every participant was sworn to secrecy under the Official Secrets Act. The cost of this silence was immediately and dramatically borne by the intellectual warriors who had won the invisible war. Dr. Elara Vance, the quiet mathematician whose analytical genius had cracked the M4 rotor and turned the tide of the Atlantic, was the most profound victim of this directive. The irony of her situation was stark, a final, cruel twist of fate that belied her immense contribution. The person who had held the most strategically important secrets of the war, whose subtle insight into human error had saved tens of thousands of lives and accelerated victory by crucial months, is now consigned to absolute professional silence. Her wartime work, a defining contribution to the emergence of modern computing and applied cryptography, was effectively erased from the official narrative. She returned to a world that saw her only as a clever woman who had done some anonymous, clerical work during the conflict. Her expertise was unusable, her true achievements unclaimable, her past a deliberate void. Her colleagues suffered the same fate. These brilliant linguists, chess champions, and engineers were forbidden from speaking to their spouses, their children, or their future employers about the one thing that defined their lives. They carried an immense, unshareable burden, the psychological weight of knowing they had directed the hammers from heaven, yet receiving no public recognition, no professional advancement, and no historical acknowledgement. The cost of secrecy was measured not only in denial of professional recognition. Vance's theoretical breakthroughs, locked away, became lost research that the academic community had to laboriously rediscover decades later, but also in the pervasive sense of psychological burden. How does one process the strategic knowledge of having saved millions of tons of shipping without being able to speak the single word that explains one's exhaustion, one's purpose, or one's quiet pride? This suffocating enforced silence created a vacuum into which the masculine public narrative of the war immediately rushed. The official history, lacking the crucial data points from Ultra, became a simplified saga of tanks, bombs, and generals in uniform. The victory was attributed to sheer industrial capacity and unflinching courage, a narrative of visible material power. The quiet intellectual truth that the decisive factor was the brain power wielded by a collection of academics, many of them women like Dr. Vance, was buried beneath layers of official classification. The genius that had allowed the Allies to move with operational omniscience became an unwritten chapter, a powerful secret held captive in the memory of those who had fought the silent war, their brilliance traded for the institutional security of the state. The victory was public, but the method was a tightly held, somber secret, leaving the true authors of the mathematics of defeat in the shadow of a history they were forbidden to claim. The 50-year secrecy rule, that cold, absolute shroud cast over Bletchley Park, was not meant to last forever, but for the brilliant men and women it silenced, it was a sentence of historical erasure. The reckoning, when it finally arrived in the 1970s and 80s, was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing process of declassification, a deliberate peeling back of layers that exposed a profound, shocking truth. When the first hints of Ultra were finally allowed to surface, they caused a thunderclap in the military and historical communities, overturning decades of established, publicly accepted narrative. The simplistic story of industrial might and battlefield courage was suddenly forced to accommodate a far more complex, humbling truth. The war had been won by a handful of mathematicians and academics working in silence. The final comprehensive data points, once released, became the absolute proof of the central thesis. The sheer volume of savings directly attributable to ultra-intelligence transformed the perception of the conflict from a grim, grinding war of attrition into a targeted surgical campaign. The new numbers were devastatingly precise. The specific U-boat toll revealed to be hundreds of vessels sunk with prior knowledge of their position, confirming that the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic was not a breakthrough in anti-submarine technology, but the simple act of reading the enemy's mail. The accelerated D-Day success was definitively quantified by the months the deception saved, and the thousands of lives saved was proven by the strategic redeployment of German forces away from the invasion beaches. These statistics were the final material evidence that the victory was not merely a matter of who had the most materiel, but who possessed the most perfect, actionable knowledge. The narrative returns finally to Dr. Elara Vance, now in her later years, a quiet, unassuming figure living in a world that had assigned the glory elsewhere. The irony of the delayed thunderclap was that when the truth finally emerged, the world was already too late to fully appreciate the magnitude of her genius. She was, at last, able to speak, to detail the intricacies of the M4 rotor and the brilliant analytical labor that saved the convoys. But the history books had already been written, the statues had already been erected. She was a footnote, struggling to become a chapter in a volume that had long since been closed. The cost of secrecy had not merely been the denial of professional recognition, it was the theft of a rightful historical legacy. The final rhetorical statement of the war's true nature is this: the conflict was not won by the 300,000 planes that filled the skies, the visible, spectacular force of industrial supremacy, but by the 3,000 brilliant minds at Bletchley who directed them. It was not won by the millions of tons of steel and high explosive that annihilated the fuel plants, but by the 3, 4, or 5 rotations of an electro-mechanical machine, guided by a mathematician's single, brilliant, and ultimately erased insight. The thesis is proven relentlessly. The industrial might of the Allies was merely the weapon, the unlimited resource of the American avalanche serving as the club. But the human, technical genius, the intellectual rigor of the men, and critically, the women of Bletchley Park, exemplified by Dr. Vance's M4 breakthrough, was the actual strategy, the eye that aimed the blow. The somber conclusion remains an enduring indictment of the system that prioritized security over truth. The greatest debt of the Second World War was not to the heroes whose names were printed in banner headlines, but to the people history was not permitted to remember, the quiet, analytical geniuses who waged the invisible war, their profound contribution buried under the Official Secrets Act, transforming their crowning achievement into an unwritten chapter of sacrifice and silence.